is Leora Norwood. I am the director of the Network for Social Justice and one of tonight's sponsors. I will introduce the rest in just a few minutes. And I wanted to start off tonight with a land acknowledgement. We think it is important to begin a program that is about housing in Winchester and who lives in Winchester with a statement about who lived in Winchester. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people who were tied by kingship to the Narragansett, Nipmuc, Pawtucket, Pennacook, and the Wampanoag, and whose traditions, languages, and stewardship continue today through their lineal descendants. These and other tribal nations lived on and were stewards of these lands for thousands of years before European colonists decimated their population and displaced them. The son squaw of Missatec, misnamed Squaw Sachem, led the Massachusetts in the 1600s. As we learn about past, present, and future housing options in Winchester tonight, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the first stewards of this land and to aspire to promote equity in living up to their example moving forward. And I can't think of a better mission statement to begin tonight with. I would also like to remind all those who are just joining us and those who have joined us that we are recording tonight's program for those who are not able to make it. Even though you are not likely to end up on camera, we are doing our best to spotlight only speakers. If you are uncomfortable even with that possibility, please turn off your video and you can turn them on at any point, but that way you will ensure that you will not be spotlighted. Next slide, please. So I am delighted that this program is one of collaboration, and I am the director of the Network for Social Justice, and I'm so pleased to have with me two fantastic co-sponsors tonight. One, the Winchester Housing Partnership Board, and two, the Winchester Planning Board. Now you know a little bit anyway about the organizations that are sponsoring tonight. We were hoping to start by getting a little bit of a sense of who's joining us in tonight's program. And for that, we would like you to answer a very short poll. So you'll have just about 30 seconds for this poll, but we'd love to get a sense of who's with us tonight and what the constituents in Winchester, what the community looks like who has opted to join this program. Give you just a few moments to fill this out. We will then end the poll. I can see that quite a few folks are filling it out. And I'm happy for one, not to give away all the results of the poll, but to see so many people joining us who had been in part one. That's fabulous. The poll will immediately shut off in just a few moments, but really we have about 70% of you who have voted. If the remainder of you would love to, this is another way for us to let in a few more participants before we continue to get going. Okay. Thank you, everybody who filled out the poll. And we will share those results a little later on in the program. Tommy, if you could shift slides. Okay, it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Diab Jurius, who is going to take us through a little bit of the agenda for tonight and how things are going to look.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. Welcome back, all those who are here for program number one, and welcome to those who are just joining us for the first time. So tonight's program is going to be looking at some of last program we looked at how we got where we are, and tonight we're going to be looking at history of the remediation efforts, a brief overview of some of our current housing initiatives, some benefits and concerns that people have about diversifying our housing stock. Our town planner will be providing us some ideas of what are the strategies for change, and then we're going to be talking a little about where we go from here. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we had really hoped we would have available for this program was the completion of a survey of the North End, and what was going to be a look at the people who lived there and the houses they lived in, and to present a sort of a cultural and architectural history of that area, in particular because that's where the small historical Black community lived, and where a lot of the workers who lived in the industrial areas of Winchester lived. Unfortunately, we will not be able to present that tonight. It hasn't reached its final review, but we will hopefully have another program which will focus just on that topic. And so I hope you can join us for that. Next slide, please. So coming up next will be a presentation by John Sabir from the Housing Partnership Board, as well as Alan Rogers from the Housing Partnership Board, both who have had extensive experience in the housing, how shall I put it? They have a deep knowledge of housing in Winchester and in the state. They'll be talking a lot about what is available to us in terms of programs and initiatives, and I'm just going to turn this over to John. Thank you.
Thank you. In looking at and evaluating potential future strategies, it's important that these strategies be developed in a way that reduce, if not eliminate, housing discrimination. And so I'm going to begin with some comments on the fair housing laws of Massachusetts and the United States. It's also important that we, where appropriate, build on existing programs that have proven to be successful. And so I'm going to comment on the work of the Winchester Housing Authority and something called inclusionary housing, excuse me, which I will define. And then Alan will conclude this section by talking about the origins and background and work of the the Massachusetts Chapter 40B Comprehensive Permit Law. So the next slide. This is a listing of it was intended to be 14 classes of discrimination that is prevented in buying or renting homes under the fair housing laws. It looks like ancestry got dropped off at one point. So the first thing that jumps out is that there's a lot of protected classes here, and so they include gender, gender identity, disability, age. I'm going to comment on just the three that are in italics, beginning with race, and then on the next two slides, family status, meaning the number of school-age children, and sources of income, referring to, this should be section 8, rental vouchers. In terms of race, last July, Suffolk University published a report in which they conducted tests throughout the greater Boston region on how different groups were discriminated against. They found that Blacks, in applying for rental housing, were discriminated against 71% of the time. So I didn't say 10%, I didn't say 20%, I said 71%. Think about that. That is far higher than what they expected. In part for that reason, they titled their report, "Qualified Renters Need Not Apply." The next slide, please. There is a part of the federal fair housing rule called the disparate impact rule. This is a somewhat plain English version of that. And it says that a disparate impact, such as discrimination against school-age children, occurs when one group of a protected characteristic is adversely affected more than another, even though the program or itself situation, such as a public hearing, is formally neutral. Translating this even into more simple language for the town of Winchester, what the interpretation of this rule is that the number of school-age children should not be a factor, and I repeat, should not be a factor that is considered by the planning board, the select board, or the zoning board of appeal, or any other government body in deciding whether to approve a proposed housing development. If you do that, then you are in danger of violating the Fair Housing Act. And what we have seen is that it's very common in considering any kind of a mixed income housing project to question the number of students and to say that it will be more expensive to educate those students. The next slide. The Winchester Housing Authority, I want to just briefly introduce them. They operate 2 units of senior housing at Wesley Street and Palmer Street. Of those units, 15 are used for people with disabilities who are under age 60. They also have family housing that they provide at 13 locations throughout the town of Winchester. What's interesting, and most of us, including myself, don't realize, is that the housing authority, these 2 housing authority programs account for roughly half, or just under half, of the affordable housing, or what's known as the subsidized housing inventory for the town of Winchester. And so when we talk later on this evening about options that can increase Winchester's housing inventory, we should look at what more can be done by the housing authority. The housing authority also administers 145 Section 8 rental vouchers. These vouchers can be used anywhere. They're mobile vouchers. They do not count in the housing inventory. Roughly half of these vouchers currently are being used in Winchester, and under with the use of these vouchers, a family or household would in general pay no more than 30% of its adjusted gross monthly income for rent and utilities. I want to go back now to the Suffolk University study in which they conducted testing throughout the greater Boston region. They found that 80% of voucher holders were discriminated against when they looked for rental housing. And the discrimination occurred whether the individuals were white or Black. And that was another reason for the report title of qualified renters need not apply. The next slide, please. Okay, inclusionary housing. In newly constructed multi-family developments, this policy, this practice requires or provides that a given share of units be affordable to moderate and middle income households. This started back in the mid 1990s, where 2 first-time homebuyer units were included as part of the Willows. This is located off Cross Street. This was negotiated in as part of the approval process. We subsequently have negotiated 10 additional units in 5 separate developments, and they include the Greystone, 15 Dick Street, 36 Elmwood. In 2016, we took that policy and that practice, we included it as part of the new zoning that was being developed for the town center or the central business district. And this zoning bylaw requires that 10% of the units in buildings with 6 or more units be affordable to households, to essentially, I'm just going to say moderate income households. For buildings that are larger than 25 units, an additional 5% of the units are to be affordable for middle income households. This has now been applied and has been approved for the 654 Main Street development, which is the Fells Hardware site. There are 36 units being built. 6 of those will be affordable. In 2019, this bylaw was extended to include North Main Street. And so with that, I will turn it over to Alan Rogers.
Hi, I'm Alan Rogers. I'm a retired lawyer. I've lived in Winchester since 1962, and while here, have been involved in housing issues most of the time. I'm going to talk about the state's comprehensive permit law, Chapter 40B. There are 2 slides that you will see and have with you to refer to. This law was passed by the legislature in 1969, and it followed a legislative report which found that there was considerable discrimination, particularly on account of race, in non-urban areas, and that some legislative solution was necessary. This law, the 40B, was passed in its first year, and it's still the only law of its kind in the country. Here's the way it works. First of all, and when somebody wants to apply for low and moderate income housing and complies with the statute, instead of going around a lot of local boards, they go one place. In Winchester, that's the Zoning Board of Appeals. And the Zoning Board holds hearings, considers all sorts of presentations and evidence, and then makes a decision. The rough standard for making a decision is to weigh the need for low and moderate income housing in the region, not just the town, the region, against the planning provisions that affect the development, and make a decision as to whether or not a permit should be granted. Sometimes, often, permits are granted with conditions. That's how local communities try to guarantee that the planning considerations are taken into account in the development. In Winchester, I won't go into any detail on what's happened under 40B, but we've had 2 recent 40B permits being approved. One is on Cambridge Street across from the Horn Pond Plaza. The second is off River Street. And those are both rental projects, and they're likely to begin construction this year. In other situations, there's been discussions about Chapter 40B, and a phenomenon that's really taking place across the whole state is what we call a friendly 40B. That is, the development conditions are negotiated between the local town, its boards, and the developer, and they agree on a permit, and then the permit goes through the Chapter 40B process at the local Zoning Board of Appeals. And we have several of those under discussion. People estimate that Chapter 40B permits have accounted for some 80% of all the lower moderate income housing units built in the state since 1969. So it is obviously a very important factor in producing housing. That's all I have.
Okay, hello again. We thought it was a good moment. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, John, to pause and reflect on a few questions if we have any questions in the chat. So the first thing we thought we would do is, and I'm going to invite Brian Zacchelli to join me here, is to show you the results of the polls, which Brian is doing now. So do you own or rent your home? Multiple choice, all of these. Own was 97%, whereas rent was 3%. I invite you all to also think about the implications of some of these questions that we polled. How long have you lived in town? Again, this was only, I believe, 37 to 39 people who answered this. 0 to 5 years was 8%. 6 to 10 years was 19%. 11 to 20 years, not an insignificant amount of time, was 14%. And over 20 years was almost 60% of folks, 22 people. Precinct do you live in? Definitely the precinct that had the most number of people was precinct 3, followed closely by precinct 4 with 22%. But people distributed across all the precincts joining us tonight. And the HPP outlines the need to create 600 affordable units in town. Where would you like to see more multifamily housing? Downtown near transit, 84% of you. Small scale developments in small neighborhoods was 51% of you. This is interesting, all distributed. Appropriately scaled, larger developments was 38%. Last, did you attend program 1? We were so happy to see 70% of you returning and 30% of you or 11 of you joining us for the first time. And if you did not catch the recording, we are happy to provide it for you. So I'm going to stop sharing the poll here and instead offer a moment of reflection on what John and Ellen were talking about and an opportunity to ask any questions you might have at this stage. I see that there is, oh, I apologize, yes?
Sorry, Lyra, I was going to say, it looks like, yeah, there is a chat question is can you please define affordable? I don't know if that was going to go to potentially Alan or John who mentioned that. If not, I can take that.
I can answer that if you would like.
Please go for it,
Tommy,
John.
I'm going to ask you also to go back a slide, please. There's a request. Great. Take it away.
I think there are two ways of, there's a number of ways of looking at what defines affordable. Basically, I would view it as serving moderate and middle income households. So that's a qualitative definition. If you want to get into numbers, the zoning bylaw defines the first category as serving households earning less than 80% of the Boston area median income. For a household size of 3, I believe that's around $82,000 a year. We're also talking about serving households earning between 80 and 120% of the Boston area median income, and that's represents an annual income of $122,000. So the rental vouchers will serve a very low income, getting down to 30% of the Boston area median income. The work under the inclusionary zoning bylaw is really aimed at the, roughly the 80%, and with some units above that. That 80 to 120% window is frequently referred to as workforce housing.
So thank you, John. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Brian, would you like to choose the next question?
Sure. It says, I think I would be helped to explain what affordable definition counts for meeting our goal of 10% under 40B. So that's somewhat related to the first question. I think that was kind of half answered and so I will at least say that the definition really counts if it's 80% of the area median income and below. So that's a short answer to that question, but I think another quick one that's here I can answer is, does each town have a certain number of percentage of units which must be affordable or 40B? Yes, that answer is 10%. If you get to 10%, I'm going to talk a little bit further about this, of what this means a little later in terms of safe harbor. But yes, every city or town must or is coaxed into getting to 10% for with a number of different incentives. So, but the answer is 10%.
So I will say to everyone that we are compiling all of the questions together. There will be there's going to be another short question period, another longer question period at the end. And our intern Grace is hard at work making sure we don't lose even one question. And so I think right now we will move on. We'll actually have we'll ask for some of your involvement for the next section that we are about to cover. And for right now, I will say, hold your questions or put them in the chat. We are taking care of them. We are going to be focused on them. I'm happy that there are so many and that there are so many folks engaged in this. So we are going to shift gears just a little bit. And we figured that there was no way of having a program looking at sort of the past, the future, and strategies of housing without thinking a little bit about how to talk about benefits and concerns of transforming or diversifying Winchester's housing stock. We know by the overwhelming turnout to this program and the last program that many folks on this call are interested in this topic and probably thinking a lot about the benefits that could be had from doing this type of work and from what these types of shifts diversifying housing stock, affordable housing could bring. But we wanted to spend a few minutes highlighting some of the benefits because we think that by highlighting them, by talking through them, by hearing from some of you, we're going to have a better tools to have these conversations with others. This is actually part of sort of thinking through the beginning of advocacy for these changes. So I would love to hear from you all. You can put it in the chat if you'd like, or say it right out loud. What could some of the benefits of diversifying housing stock be? Why do this? Anyone, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to call it out.
Diversifying the population of the town.
And why would it be beneficial to, thank you, Tori, why would it be beneficial to diversify the population of the town?
Because it would make people more understanding of different people and create more harmony in the environment.
Yep, town would feel more inclusive. It would create a more diverse town, a more inclusive town, both for youth growing up here, as well as for those who are here, those who are aging in place here. Someone else said that it would enable young people to afford rental housing versus driving long distances to their jobs, allow people who have grown up in town to stay here. I think that's a very similar point. Now we're cooking. Keep residents long-term. Diversifying the character of the town by race, ethnicity, language, practice, and many interesting points of view. So enriching the town and the character of the town. People have to work, people who work in town could actually live where they work. People who work in town cannot afford to live here. Yes. Okay, so Tommy, let's see some of the things that we came up with, and we'll speak through some of those. A lot of what has already been mentioned here. So enhancing community. A lot of you have said, the first thing Tori said, enhancing community, more multicultural, vibrant town center, opportunities to have lived experience of multicultural, multiracial, and multi-ethnic sense of themselves and their community in the community they're living. It's not about them going to university or going to the big city and then having those experiences. They can have them in Winchester. That also means that we're getting better, we're practicing collaboration across difference. And enhancing opportunities for the business community in Winchester as well. That becomes a financial gain for the town. That's all about enhancing the community. The town can embody the stated values of inclusion and anti-racism. Winchester has stated itself as an anti-racist community. The select board put out a human rights statement. Last summer, the joint anti-racism statement signed by so many folks in town. MA Association of School Committees. A lot of this has been adopted by Winchester to make it a more inclusive and addressing anti-racism specifically in the town. So one way to do this is by diversifying our housing. Thinking about addressing systemic racism through housing and the work of reparations, of thinking of what we've gained as a community through the practice of redlining, maybe indirectly, maybe no fault of our own, but we have lived this experience, and then thinking of how to target this practice and how to move forward, how to start thinking about a redistribution, a shifting of resources where other communities, other urban communities are getting overdeveloped, bringing some of the development to Winchester and helping or alleviating some of the overcrowding in urban areas. Value of health equity. A lot of folks are talking about the fact that anti-racism work through diversifying housing has a direct connection to health equity work, to thinking about the fact that where you live has a big impact on how long you are going to live and how well you are going to live. And thinking about bringing new folks into Winchester and increasing access as a way to transform health outcomes for populations. Maintaining safe harbor. This is something that Brian Zacchelli is going to talk about in a few moments, but this is another big benefit of thinking about diversifying our housing stock. And Tommy, if you go to the next slide. So what is safe harbor? Safe harbor allows for continuous growth over time, where the town maintains control of whether or not to approve a project or how long as it continues to produce housing. 40 units yearly. We will talk about safe harbor in just a few minutes, but the way a town gets to safe harbor is through approving a housing production plan that produces units at the required rate of 0.5% or 40 units a year. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but that's another benefit because that puts development back in the town's hands or the town's control. Tommy, if you can go back to one slide. Creating a community inclusive of residents of all ages and abilities. And I saw a lot of that talked about in the chats. Seniors can age in place or in the town that they love / they grew up in / that their families in. Learning about disabilities and thinking about disability is natural, and there are folks with disabilities who can live right in the town, close to parents, close to caretakers, and in a way that makes them feel independent and allows them that independence. So there's a lot of ways that this creates inclusive community for all residents of all abilities. So I'm going to move on just a little bit, and we are going to focus in on these benefits. And one way of doing that is I invite Kathy Boyle to join us. Kathy Boyle is a commissioner of the Winchester Housing Authority. Where are you, Kathy? There you are.
Right here.
Is a commissioner of the Winchester Housing Authority and the president of Autism Housing Pathways, a Massachusetts nonprofit that helps people with developmental disabilities and their families find or create housing. She is also the parent of a 29-year-old man with nonverbal autism who grew up in Winchester and now lives in Woburn in a licensed group home. The home is owned by a family-controlled, limited equity housing cooperative. Kathy, thank you so much for being here today.
Equity?
Thank you.
We've definitely found, not just the last program, but through a lot of the work that we do at the network, that hearing about sort of personal experiences really grounds a lot of the policy, legal aspects that we're talking about, the history that we're talking about. So we're so happy to have you with us. And Kathy, I think the first question I have for you is, how did you get into this field? And if you could tell us a little bit about your personal or your professional connections to these issues of affordable housing and specifically accommodation.
So, as with most things in the disability community, I got involved because I have a kid. I was originally working 10 years ago with families when our goal was to create housing for our kids. And what we discovered was, gee whiz, housing's genuinely complicated. And everybody is reinventing the wheel every time they do something new. So maybe what we really need is an umbrella organization to do the research and disseminate it so that people aren't spinning their wheels all the time. Sort of our goal is that to create a matrix of housing options. So tell me a little bit about your family member and a little bit about your resources, and we can figure out what they're eligible for. And then maybe hopefully in this matrix, we have a housing model that might work for your kid. Part of the problem, of course, is that there are lots of holes in that matrix. And so we spent a lot of time working on that.
So, okay, so we understand sort of professionally and personally how you came to this work and how that's, I think, created the rich wealth of experience that you have in talking to us tonight. What exists for housing options for folks with disabilities? Yeah, that's my first question.
Okay, so in general, not restricted to Winchester, there are a lot of different housing options. You might find 4 or 5 people living in a group home, but that's a very small minority of adults with disabilities who live in that kind of model. You might have 1 or 2 people with disabilities living in an apartment or a house with a caregiver. You might have a person with a disability and a caregiver living in an accessory unit, or a person with a disability living alone in an accessory unit. You might have one or more people with disabilities living in an apartment with drop-in services. And so, so that's sort of the waterfront. But frankly, most of that doesn't exist in Winchester.
So I guess I have two-part question. What does exist and what would you like to see existing?
Okay, so what we have is, John Serbier mentioned earlier, there's 13.5% of units in state elderly housing are set aside for adults 18 to 59 with disabilities. And that translates into 15 people living in, either, across Wesley and Palmer Street units. But frankly, that's fairly limiting because it's only people who can live alone. And then the other option is the portable vouchers, the Section 8 vouchers. And those can be used in a variety of models, but their use in Winchester is restricted by the lack of range of housing stock. And it's also limited by rents that exceed what a voucher will cover. You're not using a Section 8 voucher to rent the penthouse at the Mandarin Oriental on Boston Common. There is a cap on what a Section 8 voucher will pay for. And in Winchester, for a one-bedroom unit, that cap is $1,950 a month. So all you have to do is look at real estate listings and see there aren't a whole lot of one-bedroom units in Winchester that rent for under $1,950 a month. And that's why a lot of those vouchers go out of town. What a lot of people don't realize is at least 30% of people are, actually it's over a third of people on the centralized housing waiting list for Section 8 vouchers in Massachusetts have disabilities. Now, in terms of what I'd like to see a broader range of housing stock, including places where people could use a voucher. So, for example, where rents don't exceed what's affordable. The rents are basically capped under Section 8 at 100% AMI. And based on what John and Alan were saying earlier, you can see that's considered affordable housing. So you have to have that affordable housing for somebody with a voucher to be able to use it in town at all.
Right, getting us back into that question of
right. And then similarly, zoning that permits families to create solutions, because a family doesn't have to, if a one-bedroom unit rents in town for $2,100 a month, and your kid with a disability has a housing voucher that'll pay $1,950 a month. If you had an accessory unit, you could rent it to your kid for $1,950 a month. So you are creating housing options for people with disabilities if that zoning flexibility is there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. That gives us sort of a snapshot also for how that puzzle piece would fit into Winchester. Last question. I know that we're rushing. What gives you some hope on this issue? Or, and I know I'm throwing a question at you, what models have you seen in Winchester or elsewhere that you're excited about?
Okay, so I went through a range of models before, and I've seen excellent examples for each of them of things that work. I haven't seen many of them in Winchester. As you can tell with my own son, we had to go to Woburn to create something that worked. But oddly enough, this is going to sound awful, but one of the things that gives me hope is a function of COVID. Because what COVID did was rip the lid off a whole bunch of things that weren't working. And there's a recognition that we need to create options other than group homes. The group homes were killing fields. The mortality rates in group homes were over seven times higher than they were in the general population. One of the substitute staff at my son's house died. Every resident of my son's house got COVID. Similarly, we also recognized that, alternatives to group homes include things like, the accessory unit. What's not widely known is, I wasn't allowed to see my son from the beginning of March or the middle of March until the beginning of July. And then I could only see him outside until the 1st of October. The young adults have not reacted well to this. My son now thinks I don't belong in his house and he'll only let me in for 10 minutes at a time. So, the willingness to look at new models based on what we've seen coming out of COVID is important. And that's a model that also extends to the elderly who are in nursing homes. Again, those other housing models can improve health outcomes. Other things that give me hope. For one thing, more people know people with disabilities than did 20 years ago. I think that lowers the fear factor. And HUD has been loosening their criteria for who qualifies for mainstream vouchers for people with disabilities. And so now it's less likely people will actually have to become homeless before receiving help. In my work, I spend a lot of time telling people that the family home is actually the waiting room for homelessness. And finally, on the local level, the Housing Authority voted a little over a year ago to create a Section 8 preference for local residents with disabilities. And that has decreased the waiting time for a Section 8 voucher for a person with a disability in Winchester from about 6 years to about 2 years.
Wow, okay. Kathy, I think we're going to have a lot of questions for you in the chat as we move forward, but I really wanted to thank you for that. Thank you for grounding us. Thank you for giving us a 360 on this. And we're going to move on a little bit from thinking about benefits and thinking about things that Kathy has laid out for us individually and personally to moving to, Tommy, next slide, moving to common concerns. And I am going to try to sort of keep this moving along because we do have a lot for you as we're thinking about strategies next. So quickly, same process that we went through with benefits. What do you hear about as common concerns, as common worries when people start talking about diversifying housing or affordable housing? What are the tropes? Could be in the chat.
Schools will be overcrowded.
Schools will be overcrowded. We're gonna talk through these quickly. Traffic. Oh, great. Property values drop, traffic, anything else? You're literally knocking off my list. Parking is already a problem, increased crime. Anything else? Okay, Tommy, let's open it up. We pretty much touched on each one of them. Crowding schools, again, negative. Number one is probably the negative impact on the school system is what you hear the most. That there will be a negative impact, too large an influx of new students with affordable housing. That's a frequently raised concern. One point to note on that is the biggest feeder of new students coming into schools comes from people aging out of their community and selling their homes to families with children. So statistically, that is the number one way that we are seeing an increase in students in schools, and there will be somewhat of an increase. And I think we need to talk a little bit about it. Dropping the overall rating of our high school with lower ability students. Yes, I think that is part of the negative impact on schools. Thank you, whoever brought that up. That's a really good point with Section 8 housing. Increased traffic, a number of you mentioned it. Housing advocates argue that traffic concerns are overstated and often used when concerns are actually about diversity of class, dropping, as someone said, the rating of high schools. It's coded language a lot of the time. They will build crappy, dilapidated, unlivable housing for Section 8. Interesting. Okay. Home values will decrease. This is another big one that I think I also saw definitely in the chat. There is an abundance of research indicating that mixed income housing does not actually result in lower home values in the surrounding area. And occasionally there are studies that talk about how this has happened, especially in some crowded urban areas. So again, something to discuss. And one of the reasons that we're bringing up these common concerns is not necessarily completely to bust them, although I think that's part of it, but also for us to start walking around this, perambulating around how we would engage in conversation when these concerns are brought up. What would we say? What would we cite? And then disagreements about the process. And here we're talking about concerns about contracting and miscellaneous details about the process of creating affordable housing. So I think there has been a lot of examples of this historically. This is not the forum of benefits or concerns to talk about any particular project, but we're currently seeing this in town. Objections to affordable housing can be focused on the specific contracts the town enters into, or small or large aspects in this process, such as choice of developer or the specific choice of site. So that is something that definitely can rip at town fabric, that can cause discord, that is cited among a common concern. So we're definitely seeing more of talking about increased traffic, new families. And I think we can continue this conversation, especially as we have questions maybe about some of these common concerns or the benefits or the talking points behind either one of them when we have the longer Q&A. Tommy, I will ask you to go to the next slide. And I would like to introduce Diab to come back and talk to us a little bit as we move into thinking about exactly what Winchester housing types and needs look like right now. What's the status?
Thank you, Leora. So half of the slide people have seen from the first program, and the second half you haven't. So Winchester, as we know, is predominantly has the predominant type of housing is a single family detached home. So we have very few, where 72% of our houses are homes are one family detached. So we're not talking about things like condos or townhouses. We're talking about our standard old fashioned single family detached. On the right side, this is an interesting diagram, and what it shows is if you look at any particular part of town, how many of the houses in that part have 3 or more bedrooms. So we're talking about what are called family-sized housing units. And what you'll see is in that the majority of the town, that's the dark blue, 76 to 100% of the units are 3+ bedroom units. You'll see the other two sections are 51 to 75% for the purple and 26 to 50% for the teal. This might look remarkably like the red zone map that you saw last time, and that's not surprising because a lot of the development has been in the areas that were considered, the single family development was in the areas that were considered good places to develop. The other thing that's important to recognize is that a lot of households in Winchester are really housing cost burdened. That means they're spending more than 30% of their annual income on housing costs. And that's to the point that 20% of the Winchester households in 2018 made less than 80% of the area median income, which means that they would be eligible for subsidized housing. So we have a large need within Winchester alone, not just in the region around us, for some type of moderate income housing. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the very recent developments in Winchester, which have affordable components. And so there are 6 of them. One of the things I want to point out to you are the totals at the bottom, where you can see the number of market rates, the number of affordable units, the total number of units. And then at the very last column, there's something called SHI units. And those are the units that are eligible towards the state's subsidized housing inventory, which works into whether or not the town gets safe harbor. The key thing that you would notice is that if you have a property which has 100% rental units at 80, then you can count all of those units, even if only a fraction of them are actually affordable. So for instance, let's take the 416 Cambridge Street project, for example. There are 72 market rates, 24 affordable, so only a third of those approximately are actually affordable units, but we can count the entire 96 towards our subsidized housing inventory. That's that 10% the state's looking for. But what it really means is that we're not getting 96 actual affordable units. We're only getting 24. So when we look at how we're producing moderate income or affordable housing, we have to look at what the actual need is. And when we have 20% of our households who need affordable housing, that is on the order of 600 to 700 total actual units, not the units that end up under SHI units, but the units that would fall under that affordable column. So we have a long ways to go. And next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. I will be spotlighted again in a second. I invite Diab to stay up here. We wanted to give another moment for reflection. I know that folks are scrambling in the chat with questions. Happy for Diab or Brian to read out one. Happy to take a moment's pause if folks need a moment pause as well here. We've covered a lot. Either Brian or Diab, feel free to grab a question from the chat.
Sure. I will grab one. I have the question doc up here and says, what is limited equity? So I believe that this question was during
That had to do with my son's house, and frankly, it's completely irrelevant for this discussion. It is a way that we structured the ownership of his house so that it could be affordable to new families over time if they moved in. So it means
misunderstanding the word equity there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the value of the property doesn't, what somebody can sell their stock for is not the same as the market rate, that we've put an artificial cap on how much people's value can appreciate in my son's group home. It's completely irrelevant for the rest of this discussion.
Sorry about that. So here, this last one I see here, do we have information on age for people below a certain AMI? I do not believe we have, so we have income limits, whether or not the town has cross-referenced those with specific age, that has not been done. It looks like a question was already answered in the chat about local preference. John Serbier, if you wanted to talk a little bit about local preference for 45 seconds, that would be great in terms of what that means for affordable housing in the town of Winchester.
Sure. Under the state guidelines, a local preference can be given to 70% of the units, where a local preference means someone who is already living in Winchester or someone who is working in Winchester. And so what this means is that for 70% of the units, we're not having people move in here from some foreign country. They're going to be already living in Winchester. They're going to be cost burdened, and they will benefit from that.
Thank you for that, John.
I see a great question here about safe harbor, and I'm just wondering, Brian, if you want to take it or we want to go into the strategy section where you're probably going to answer it.
In terms of why exactly is reaching safe harbor a desirable goal? Yeah. So no, we can. There's a number of nuance here, and it does relate a lot also to the rental housing question that is also there in terms of what is this loophole potentially about rental units counting towards affordable housing when it's rented at market value. So I'm going to explain a little bit about this. One is, so if 25% of any given project development, if 25% is at the affordable limit, which is 80% of AMI and below, for a family of four, it's about $100,000. So that's the income limit. That the maximum house price that family of four could buy is about $240,000. So what is 40B? What is affordable? That the understanding what that is, which is basically two things. There are income limits, and then there are total housing cost limits. So that's what the law does. It sets these limits, and it also, I'm going to talk a little bit further on a few next slides, essentially just allows zoning to kind of go out the window. So it's the incentive from the state to create mixed income housing, but they're also trying to not only incentivize mixed income housing, but they're also trying to incentivize rental housing. So the idea is all of them counting that's the state trying to create more rental housing around transit in as well as in neighborhoods. And I still think super quick, why exactly is reaching safe harbor a desirable goal? That's not necessarily the goal for all the people in town. So that is definitely one of the goals of the HPP. I'm going to have a slide on that as well. So yeah, the idea of safe harbor being a desirable goal, some people are like, no, really the desire is to create more units. It's not necessarily to completely be in control. It's more of what do we need to do to create the right type of units in the right location. And what could happen, I'm reading here, what could happen in Winchester if we don't create 40, if we're out of safe harbor? The quote risk is that a potential maybe larger development that might be inappropriate for its surroundings might be kind of forced upon us. So that's the difference of if you're out of safe harbor, then you don't have a clear way to deny a project. Whereas if you are under safe harbor, that's enough of a reason to deny a project. You can say we have safe harbor because we're either producing 40 or 80 units in a given year or two, or we're at the total of 10%.
So Brian, I think we should sort of cut questions short because I know there's going to be time at the end, but also your presentation is hefty and it's up next. So Tommy, next slide. It is my pleasure to introduce, although you've kind of already been introduced to him, Brian Zacchelli, town planner, who will explain some of the strategies that the Commonwealth, the town of Winchester, and other municipalities have used to try to make real change here in the landscape of housing equity. So strategies for change. Brian, take it away.
Next slide, please. So this kind of talked right into my question about the housing production plan and what that is. And so in communities like Winchester, where less than 10% of the units are deed restricted affordable, so that's what we keep talking about this on the subsidized housing inventory, developers may override zoning to create these mixed income developments that have an affordable component. The most recent ones talked about were River Street and Cambridge Street. So to have more control over these 40B process and the developers, there is a path. The path is creating a housing production plan, and then housing production plans, or HPPs, they're used as a menu of options that are tailored for a specific town, tailored specifically to our town, to create affordable and other types of multifamily housing. So it was a select board, planning board initiative where the Metropolitan Area Planning Council was hired to perform the task over 12 months. There were a number of public meetings, outreach activities, and the plan was actually approved by the Department of Housing and Community Development in 2018. Next slide, please. So like I said, if the town has an HPP on file and then also either creates 0.5% of our total units or 1%, either 1.5 in 1 year or 1% in 2 years, that's what gives us safe harbor for 1 or 2 years. So this is another way to get safe harbor. Everyone talks about the 10%. That is one way to get safe harbor. You have to have an HPP on file and get 10%. Another way to get safe harbor is to have an HPP on file and make these small increments of building affordable units. At in our particular case, because we're at about 8,000 total housing units, it's at 40 or 80 units in a year or two. And like I said, housing advocates are generally more interested in creating the right types of low and moderate income units in town rather than really trying to achieve safe harbor. Next slide, please. So there were only two there were only two objectives of the HPP that was guided by town. One was to increase the supply of affordable housing for low and income households to meet and maintain safe harbor status. So that was actually spelled out as one of the objectives, is to create this plan so that we can maintain safe harbor status. In order to do that, we would need to create, like I said, 40 in a year or 80 in 2. The other objective was to increase the supply of what the region calls naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is a diversity of housing types, not just single family homes, for example. So it's homes and units for seniors or young households, first time home buyers, smaller households, people with disabilities. And generally, they're one of the objectives in order to do that, in order to increase that supply, has to deal with density near transit. Next slide, please. So there's a lot going on here. The HPP was generally just broken up into these 4 different categories of programming, community engagement, resource, and regulatory. So I'm going to go into a little bit further as we go a few more slides down, but these are kind of the main buckets of the different types of strategies that the HPP basically told us through a lot of public input on what types of strategies we really should be doing. So I'm going to talk a little further about a municipal housing trust, community engagement, awareness, building support. That's kind of part of what we're doing actually tonight. Resources, so funding, and then regulatory. So this is like specifically, zoning bylaw or other types of bylaw changes to create more and different types of units in town. So there are many others within each of these categories, but I've only just mentioned these few. So we're going to take next slide, please. So we're going to take a quick 2.5-minute video break. So this is a video from Tacoma, Washington, a very different city than Winchester, but has a lot of the same housing concerns that we see in Winchester all the time, and that we have for several years: housing affordability, housing supply for first-time home buyers, or downsizing seniors. So hopefully this will work. Thank you to, I'm gonna hope Tommy here. So thank you so much.
Prices and housing in general has been a major problem in Tacoma, especially as more people begin to move here. But city leaders are hoping that this new project may lay a foundation for a solution to this problem moving forward.
When you think about our housing ecosystem, it's kind of like a giant game of musical chairs. And there aren't enough chairs for the people that are trying to play.
First-time home buyers in Tacoma are well aware of how hard it is to get in that game. As the city's population rises, so does the price of homes, leaving many unable to afford one. But city leaders hope the Home in Tacoma project can begin to reverse that trend. Currently, most of Tacoma's residential areas are only zoned for single-family units. But the project aims to rezone these areas to allow multiple family units, such as duplexes and townhouses, to be built in these areas as well. Housing advocates say it's a necessary step in the right direction.
We need more of every kind of housing, and this will allow for appropriate density increases of appropriate sizes and kinds of housing. The high cost of home sales lately are reflective of too short a supply of actual housing.
Rising home prices aren't unique to Tacoma. Numbers from the National Association of Home Builders studies show that over 72% of Washington's households are priced out of being able to qualify for a mortgage. City leaders know this is just a piece of the puzzle, and that more will need to be done to fully address Tacoma's housing issues.
We also need to pair this policy with things like affordability incentives and other policies that don't just encourage growth, but encourage growth that includes housing at multiple price points, so that we are helping to house people across the economic spectrum.
Now, Tacoma went on to say that although change does not happen overnight, they are committed to acting quickly. The City Council says they plan on taking action on the proposals outlined in this project by this June. And they are also working to update the standards of the zoning and development so the city as a whole can begin moving in the direction of this project by December. For now, we're live in Tacoma. Lionel Donovan, King 5 News.
All right, Lionel, thank you.
All right. Thanks for that, Tommy.
Shopping for a new single-family home in the U.S. harder than...
No, I'm not shopping for a new single-family home in the U.S. But yeah, I saw a couple things in the chat about specific initiatives. And the idea of the video was just, I think the messages were, we have some of the same issues. And more importantly, I think all housing advocates agree that we kind of need just about every type of housing. So yeah, that's where a lot of the similarities go. So in terms of additional strategies, so that the HPP had outlined for us that we are actually making headway on. So one is the municipal housing trust. So this is outside of town government. It manages the Affordable Housing Fund, and it can actually actively seek out mixed income opportunities and make purchases, and they can actually also facilitate local control of housing initiatives. So we currently have a municipal housing trust, and their agenda for work should hopefully be coming out soon. Next slide. So this has been before the town several times, but it always been kind of during an override year so it never really had much luck or any luck. So many in town want to resurrect this idea of the Community Preservation Act. So a little more than half of Massachusetts communities have enacted the CPA. It's a variable match from the state each year, but it's basically a surcharge or a tax on your property taxes that go towards these public purposes. The law says that it can be a maximum of 3%, but typically in Massachusetts, out of these 50% of Massachusetts communities, typically the percentage is about 1 to 2% of property tax. So these are so this is an additional tax that goes towards these 4 specific things. One of them is affordable housing. Next slide, please. So just as a comparable community like Belmont, so in 2019 alone, they spent over $2 million on improvements to town hall, public tennis courts, playgrounds, police station, community pass, and several other projects just in 2019 through CPA funds. In 2018, they had similar projects that totaled about $1.4 million. So this is real money that does real good. Next slide. I know this is a lot of information, and we are going to open it up for more questions. Another strategy that is not necessarily in the HPP, but another strategy around Massachusetts that communities have been using. You may have, many people know about 40B, which is affordable housing at 25% of the units being affordable, allows you to override zoning. 40R is it's a different kind of tool. So these are zoning overlay districts that allow for increased density near transit and other services that prioritize smart growth principles. So design aesthetic, affordable housing, high density near transit. So this program was created to incent municipalities to create dense housing by offering payments and other financial incentives if the overlay is actually approved by the state and you do create units. Next slide, please. So these are just some other additional strategies that around Massachusetts that have been used. One is to allow for single family homes to not really necessarily be changed on the outside, but to be split into more multi-unit buildings, so not just duplexes. And then the last strategy I'm going to talk about super quick are inclusionary zoning overlays. So this is something that we've done in the Center Business District as well as in the GBD 2 and 3. Which is at the main street between Skillings and Woburn. And this requires affordable housing in those areas. So it's a geographic location. So the idea is to require more affordable housing in more areas or potentially through the entirety of town. I'm sorry for all the information. That was a lot. I see a lot of things in the chat. So next slide, please. We are gonna pause here. And I do have one question before I move
Brian,
on. Yes.
Sorry, I was going to make a quick suggestion, just in
Sure.
the interest of time and making sure that we can kind of go through people's questions and maybe even go over the time limit a little. I would suggest let's go a little bit further in the presentation. Let's tell folks how they can get involved, and then let's come back to the Q&A and sort of run that out for the rest of this session. Plus, if folks can stay on for a few extra minutes as well, if that's okay with you.
I'm up for however anyone needs me.
Or however I switch it out. Okay, so guerrilla change here. Let's thank you, Tommy. Let's go to the levels of change for a minute. So we've really structured this presentation moving from the past to solutions tried, to types of housing in Winchester, to looking at the need, to thinking about to thinking about strategies. And now we're really on what can we do moving forward. And the way we're sort of looking at this very generally, to bring you just for a second of theory of social movement and anti-racism theory, is thinking about the levels of change. We often say that individual, interpersonal, and systemic is a way to think about racism and how we can confront it and how we also experience it. And so turning that around, it's also a way to think about housing and making changes in housing for more equitable outcomes. So individuals, you can educate yourself. This presentation was part of that. There's going to be a lot of resources at the end. We're going to try to answer all folks' questions as well. We really encourage you and we challenge you to think about your own biases and your stereotypes, even in this work. Being able to answer the question, why is this beneficial, is super important, and being able to turn it around and sort of challenge folks on what could be some of the concerns of this is just equally as important. And that gets us to the interpersonal level. Talk to others. Please attend town meeting, engage in upcoming conversations on diversifying Winchester's housing. The network is not planning on leaving this issue. In fact, we would like you to join us. Systemically, we're thinking about building a housing coalition in Winchester. We would like to promote some structural changes in policies and regulations, and we'd like your help. We'd like your ideas, your initiative, your enthusiasm, your energy, and your help. So if we just look at the next slide, and here I'm going to ask Diab to give us sort of a sneak peek of what could be next as we start thinking through this in a very strategic way.
Thank you, Leora. So it's hard to compress the concept of an entire organization into one slide, but let's try. So what comes next? And so over the last hour or so, and in the previous part of this program several weeks ago, we talked about how and why Winchester looks like it does, the tools we have at our disposal, and how the country, the state, and our town have responded. And I'm sure you've heard of the saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I mean, Chapter 40B has been on the books for over 50 years, but we still have dramatic housing inequities. And it's not that the tools haven't been available, it's that the social and political will to make the necessary changes hasn't. So the question is, how do we, and here I mean you on the other side of the screen, fit in? There are a lot of players involved. There's town government, the select board, the planning board, the housing partnership board, town meeting, state and federal agencies. I think the key takeaway we have to have is we cannot depend solely upon elected officials to take the lead in matters of this importance. Even with the best intentions, their focus is split between putting out fires, dealing with what happens in a few months, or when the next budget cycle comes around. Even if we are lucky enough to elect someone who shares this passion, how do you ensure that changes that are made last or sustainable? Those things do not survive election cycles unless there's a deep-seated belief in the community that those changes are the right direction for town. And in small towns like ours with unpaid elected officials, long-term planning and implementation for things other than infrastructure, such as flooding our schools, is on the back burner if it's actually on the stove at all. And that's where you come in. Elected officials need to be reminded often of what's important to the residents they serve. And in Winchester, far too often, elections are uncontested. So the ballot box does not serve as a potent reminder. Instead, what we need is constant pressure, help, and guidance. So bringing housing equity to Winchester requires a deep grassroots movements to change our societal norms and attitudes, to continuously pressure elected officials to implement strategies, and to provide the extraordinary knowledge and skills which Winchester has to bear upon these issues. We have an enormous reservoir of talent that we can depend on. And we've heard about the code words the phrases local control, community character, neighborhood values. These have all been code words for no affordable housing, no rental units, no one who doesn't like me. The challenge we have is to seize back the true meanings of those words. So local control means that we take our affordable housing agenda and we make sure that when development happens, it blends into the physical environment that makes Winchester unique. People are always worried about keeping Winchester, Winchester. Community character and neighborhood values can mean inclusivity and diversity of color and background and financial status. So change is not going to be easy. It's very easy to say, let's build big buildings downtown or put them on North Main Street, but we will not get to where we need to be if that's all we do. Change is going to have to take place in every neighborhood across town. We will have to say, I want increased density in my neighborhood. I am in favor of this zoning change and I will work to see it passed. And we have to ensure that the new housing we put in isn't just high-end condos. This is going to be a really difficult path. We have a lot of choices and a lot of discussions we have to make. So Winchester will look different, but it will still be Winchester, and it will be the Winchester that we want it to be. And fundamental and sustained change requires action and resolve, and that's where you fit in. Thank you.
Thank you, Diab. Let's move on to the next slide. Next steps. Next steps from what Diab just led us through. I think you were getting the picture. We have only just begun to discuss equitable housing in Winchester and equitable housing options, and we would love your help for the next part of this journey. Sign up here, and the sign up I have is actually right here. I can put it in for you guys, and it is a Google form, and it really just gives us your email, your name, and suggests if you have any questions that you would like or any ideas about moving forward, and we will put you on a mailing list. We are planning to have a housing meeting. It will be based off a lot of what Diab presented to you all, as well as starting to think a little strategically as how we want to dig in, what we want to dig into. So we will send you, if you sign up with this Google form, and I will also send it in an email with this presentation afterwards, we will be reaching out to you, trying to schedule a time for a next get together. Next slide, please. Okay, if you have questions, and I know we are going to go back to all your questions after, but if you have questions about our next meeting or the recording or the slide deck, if you have any problem getting any of these, please email us at the Network for Social Justice office at nsfj.org. Or the planning board for technical questions about housing, zoning, and planning. So I will put both of those emails in the chat as well, but that is two ways to reach out to us. The last slide, which we don't need to focus on right now, will be sent to you, is a slide with resources. And then I am actually suggesting that there are so many questions that we now actually go back to the Q&A, and let's see if we can dig into these questions for the remaining 10 minutes. And perhaps if folks have the energy to stay on even a little bit longer. So I'm going to hand it over back to Diab, to Brian, and to John, and to Alan.
Great, thanks, Leora. So I'm just going to go right into this Google Doc that's being filled here. This is an interesting question. Is there a way to incentivize owning affordable housing to create and build equity and wealth from that ownership? So because it's capped at how much you can sell those units, it's always tough. But it looks like Alan wanted to jump on in there. I think that's a great idea. But that's generally, that's what I think is that it would be pretty hard to develop that wealth because it will not raise in value at the way a market rate unit would. I don't know if anyone else wanted to answer that.
Alan, I'll give it a try.
Please.
We've talked in the past about the possibility of persuading homeowners to apply some sort of conservation or restriction on their property, which would allow them to continue to take advantage of the appreciation, but would actually slow down the growth in market value and possibly lead the way once the people no longer need the housing, to converting that housing into something that is partly subsidized. It's a concept that I don't think has been used very much, There's a whole bunch of varieties there. And of course, the one thing you have to have is you have to have people who are willing to do this. And that we found in the past with similar programs, that's hard. People don't like to give up their own housing, even though they may be simply imposing some restrictions on it. But that's one idea that might be along those lines.
Thanks, Alan, for that. I'm just going to kind of keep moving here. So can the town do anything about the fact that developers are raising small houses and building larger houses so that the stock of the modest sized houses is diminishing? So this is a very good question, something that the planning board and others had kind of tackled a few years ago. And this was the implementation of large house review in each of the different zones. And it was basically trying to combat that along with the demolition delay bylaw that we have. So you're hitting on kind of preservation tools, which are not incredibly strong in Winchester. A demo delay basically allows a delay of the demolition to up to a year, but then it goes forward. So yes, and I see Alan again would like to add. Yes, please.
Well, I just want to point out two things. One is that a lot of other communities have been wrestling with this issue for a long time. And I think and we looked into that at the partnership board and talked to people in other places. And I think what we concluded finally is that nobody had any one solution to that issue. But there are a number of zoning changes around the outside that can be done on lot sizes and various things like that can make it create some disincentives for a developer to come in and completely demolish a smaller house. And we actually have adopted several of these in the zoning bylaw a couple of years ago. And I'm not current with what the practice is now with the demolition bylaw, so I can't tell you, whether the trend for demolishing houses and building much larger ones has abated as a result of that.
Can I piggyback onto that question of developers bulldozing, building larger houses? One of the things I've seen going on around here is people who have starter homes who are expanding them dramatically because they can't afford to buy anything larger in town. It's much cheaper for them to add a third floor, for example. And that diminishes the amount of starter homes just as much as developer bulldozing does.
Yeah, true.
All good points. We could probably keep talking about that for a bit. This is a specific question about Washington and Swanton, as this was a piece of property that the town was looking to do affordable housing with. At the moment, there's not much news with that property. It's still owned by the owner, the same owner as it was for the past year, and I'm not aware of any talk. That might be the last question, at least on this Google sheet that I see. So yeah, that's all the questions that are in the sheet that should have been transposed from the chat. I don't know if there are any other questions that maybe didn't get put in the chat, but now's your time to put them in the chat.
Brian, would you describe the recent example on Harvard Street where a smaller house is being preserved?
Sure, this is a new zoning provision that the planning board did 2 town meetings ago, which basically allows a smaller lot to be created, a really undersized lot in several respects, whether it's by how big it is or how large the frontage is, but it basically allows a smaller lot to be created if you're preserving a historical resource. So that is one. So thank you for reminding me, John. So that is another zoning tool that is being used to preserve the smaller footprint, which are tenderly our older housing stock.
So if I might jump in, there's a comment in the chat that I think is an interesting comment. And the person writes, "I'm unconvinced. I don't want increased density. I do want people with disabilities and different socioeconomic levels and other measures of diversity in my neighborhood. And that's an interesting comment, because the first question that comes to mind is, if we do want that increased diversity of economic backgrounds and all that, then we do have to reduce the cost of housing in Winchester. And we can either claim that the market works and that in order for the market to work, we have to increase the number of units, or we can claim that the market doesn't work, so we actually have to do something to intervene in order to make sure we have lower priced units. In either case, we do need many hundreds of units to be built in this town. And we don't have the land available to us to build, very large, we could build very large 300 plus units if we could find the land to do that. But Winchester has consistently said that that's not what we want our town to look like. Winchester is not known for its large developments. So if we want to be a more inclusive community, we need to put the housing somewhere. The question is where? We can't simply have sacrifice zones around town and say that's where the housing has to go. As we know from redlining and from other socioeconomic factors, there are sacrifice zones in this town, and they've been that way for 100 years. And the rest of the town has benefited from the sacrifices made in those communities. And so it's really a question of overall equity, saying that if you have benefited from the fact that you have a reasonable size house on a reasonable size lot, or a large house on a very large lot, who has made that possible? And how can you be part of the solution to making sure that everyone gets a slice of the pie? And that's really where I'm coming from in terms of our responsibilities for what we have been graciously given by others, that we knowingly, or as Laura pointed out at the beginning, that we knowingly or unknowingly took advantage of. We're here because other people gave up things, and it's our turn to return the favor.
Thank you, Diab. I think that's a great point to end on. We're just at our 9 o'clock. What we would suggest is we're going to take down every single question that we've had. We also have made everyone's emails available for those who want to email us. And when we send out both this recording as well as the slide deck to you, as well as the sign up for future meetings, we will also make ourselves available for questions and put those emails in the letter that we send as well. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this. And we kept true to our 9 o'clock. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on such a beautiful evening. Bye, everybody. I think this is actually a pretty good place to end. Tommy, I think we're good to end the recording.